Uh, Welcome. I'm Jim Gardner, Executive for Legislative Archives, Presidential Libraries, and Museum Services here at the National Archives. On behalf of David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, welcome to the National Archives. Whether you're here in the William G. McGowan Theater or joining us via YouTube. Tonight's discussion of Gary Zola's book, we called him Rabbi Abraham, Lincoln and American Jewry, is presented in celebration of Jewish American Heritage Month in partnership with the Jewish Historical Society of Washington, D.C. and President Lincoln's Cottage. After the program, Dr. Zola will stay to sign copies of this book. For those of you who've been here before we get started, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up in this theater over the next week. On Wednesday, June 7 at noon, historian Charles Rapley will tell us about his latest book, Herbert Hoover in the White House, The Ordeal of the Presidency. And then on Thursday, June 8th at 7 p.m., we will join with the National Capital Planning Commission and the National Park Service to present a panel discussion on memorials for the future, designing a memorial for the 21st century. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online at archives.gov. There are print copies of the calendar in the lobby upstairs, along with the sign-up sheet, so you can receive it by regular mail or email. You'll also find brochures about other National Archives programs and activities. Another way to get involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports the work of the agency, especially its education and outreach programs like the one tonight. You can pick up an application for membership in the foundation in the lobby or become a member online at archivesfoundation.org. A document in our Records of Rights exhibit, which you would have passed the exhibit on your way in tonight. A document in that exhibit marks an episode when President Abraham Lincoln directly interceded for American Jews. The document is General Ulysses Grant's December 1862 general order to expel Jews from the Department of Tennessee. Grant blamed Jews for smuggling and demanded their immediate removal. Jewish citizens of Paducah, Kentucky, appealed to President Lincoln, expressing their outrage, and Lincoln countermanded Grant's order. Histories cannot be written without the primary sources that tell us authentically what happened at a particular time. Grant's order to expel Jews and his later revocation of that order, documents preserved here in the National Archives, testify to a moment in history that many in the wider public are not aware of. Yet it cannot be forgotten because the records exist to tell us so. By gathering together and publishing the documents in his volume, Dr. Zola has given access to a large number of primary source documents that present and future scholars can mine in the course of their research. David Weinfeld, writing a review in the Journal of Illinois State Historical Society, called Zola's annotated collection of primary sources a highly accessible narrative. And historian Eric Foner declared, "Everyone interested in Lincoln and the Civil War, students, scholars, and lovers of history alike, owe Gary Zola a debt of thanks for compiling this fascinating book." To lead us into tonight's conversation about, we called him Rabbi Abraham, I'm going to turn to Laura Cohen Applebaum. Laura has been Executive Director of the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington and its Lillian and Albert Small Jewish Museum for the past 22 years. The museum is a steward for the historic 1876 Adas Israel Synagogue on H Street, and under Laura's leadership has played a growing role in preserving and presenting the important role of the Jewish community in metropolitan DC. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Laura Cohen Applebaum.
Thank you, Jim, for that terrific introduction and for talking so much about Dr. Zola's book, which is a fantastic read. On the pages of the book that brings us here tonight, you'll encounter several Jewish communal leaders that walk the streets just outside of what is now the National Archives. Issachar Zachary, Adolfo Solomon, and Simon Wolf. Each had interactions with President Lincoln, detailed in Dr. Zola's new book. They were among the 2,000 Jewish residents of the nation's capital during the Civil War, a burgeoning community of immigrants whose experiences were very similar to the Jews acclimating to their adopted country described in the first chapter. Lincoln sent his chiropodist, Dr. Issachar Zachary, to meet secretly with the Jewish Confederate Secretary of State, Judah P. Benjamin, at City Point to discuss peace negotiations. This is a meeting first documented documented with the primary source material in Dr. Zola's research for the first time. And David McKenzie, who was on our staff at the time, went into the Confederate States of America's papers at Gary's request to find the document that you'll find in the book. His book addresses key issues debated and strategized about around the corner at 6th and Pennsylvania in Adolfo Solomon's bookshop, which served as a salon for intellectuals in the city. Among the issues was then the open issue of whether a rabbi could serve as a military chaplain. A young lawyer, Simon Wolf, later president of Washington Hebrew Congregation, successfully pleaded clemency from President Lincoln for a Jewish soldier who had gone AWOL to visit his mother's deathbed. After the war, Wolf and Solomons invited their friend, President Ulysses Grant, to attend the dedication of Adas Israel's first synagogue, thereby making Grant the first sitting president to attend a synagogue service, perhaps in atonement for General Orders Number 11 that Jim talked about. Our organization proudly preserves this special shoal, which is going to be moved twice before reaching a final destination where we'll build an adjacent museum. We hope to tell some of the stories you'll hear tonight in that new museum. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the Jewish Historical Society, I want to thank the archivists and the staff here at the National Archives, especially Susan Clifton, for partnering again with us our 5th year of partnership for Jewish American Heritage Month. I want to thank our donors that make Dr. Zola's visit possible, David Bruce Smith, Brenda and Paul Pascal, and Dr. John and Sandra Willen. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of our president, Russell Smith. Dr. Zola is also an ordained rabbi, and his presence has led to a room full of esteemed clergy. Rabbi Bruce Lustig of Washington Hebrew, our city's first Jewish congregation, Rabbi Jonah Pesner of the Religious Action Center, and Rabbi Donald Berlin, Rabbi Emeritus of Temple Oheb Shalom in Baltimore. I'm honored to introduce tonight's speakers. Dr. Gary Zola is the Executive Director of the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives and is the Edward M. Ackerman Family Distinguished Professor of the American Jewish Experience and Reform Jewish History at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati. The AJA is the world's largest freestanding research center dedicated solely to the study of the American Jewish experience. A prolific author, Dr. Zola has written and lectured extensively on a vast array of topics exploring the American Jewish experience. In fact, he just returned from teaching in Haifa, Israel. He has served on nationally important commissions to commemorate the 350th anniversary of Jewish life in America, as well as the Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. He has been a force behind the National Steering Committee for Jewish American Heritage Month. Internationally, he serves on the U.S. Commission for the Preservation of American Heritage Abroad. Dr. Zola will be joined in conversation by Erin Carlson Mast. Erin is the executive director of President Lincoln's Cottage, where her work includes everything from historical research to site development to curation of award-winning exhibitions. For those who haven't been, you're missing out on a great site. It's where Lincoln had his summer retreat and drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. It has a not-to-be-missed museum and a historic site with cutting-edge interpretation. A current exhibition, American by Belief, is incredibly timely. It introduces to the public Abraham Lincoln's little-known immigration policies. It's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Gary Zola and Erin Carlson Mast to the stage.
Joining us here tonight. And thank you especially, Dr. Zola, for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
As Jim mentioned in his opening remarks, primary resources are essential to our work as historians. And in fact, it was primary resource documents that led to the title of your book. Can you please tell us about that?
Well, I can, and let's begin. I'm going to see if this works. What we should, if we turn on the PowerPoint, it will be a prolegomenon for my answer to your question, Erin.
We are coming, Father Abram, 300,000 more, from Mississippi's winding stream and from New England's shore. We leave our plows and workshops, our wives and children dear, with hearts full of utterance, with but a silent tear. We dare not look behind us, but steadfastly before. We are coming, Father Abram, with 300,000 more. We are coming, coming, our union to restore. We are coming, Father Abram, with 300,000 more.
So the title of this book is, as you can see, we called him Rabbi Abraham, and the purpose of the book, in a broad sense, is to try to answer the question: is how exactly did that happen? The song that you just heard is a very famous Civil War song. It was apparently written by a prominent abolitionist by the name of Gibbons, and became well known after Lincoln called for additional recruits to help defeat the rebels in 1862, and Lincoln became known by this terminology, Father Abraham. So the whole military, or many in the military, were referring to him as Father Abraham. And my question is how did he become known as Rabbi Abraham? And that came from really this really remarkable document, and I usually use this as the sockdologer, Erin, you know, as the dramatic conclusion, but we'll start right off with it. The person you're looking at is actually the uncle of Supreme Court Justice Brandeis. Mm-hmm. And in fact, some of you who know that Brandeis middle initial was Louis D. Brandeis, and that's because he took his uncle's name to honor him. So when I was looking at eulogies, I went to Louisville and I saw in the secular press the entirety of Dembitz. He was a delegate at the 1860 presidential convention, and they let him give the eulogy in 1865. And it was reproduced on the newspaper, in the newspaper. And when I read the opening lines, I couldn't believe my eyes. And this is what it said. He opens his eulogy with the words, "Friends, you often called him jocosely," which is a $25 word for humorously. "You often called him jocosely Rabbi Abraham, as if he were one of our nation. as if he was of the seed of Israel. But in truth, you might have called him Abraham, the child of our father Abraham. For indeed, of all the Israelites throughout the United States, there was none who was more thoroughly fitted to the ideal of what a descendant of Abraham ought to be than Abraham Lincoln. Well, this taught me right away that while the nation may have been referring to him, or many, as Father Abraham, the Jews were, at least in Louisville, Kentucky, and I suspect elsewhere, were already in entre nous referring to him as Rabbi. My question was, why?
Mm-hmm. So you had that question. There are so many volumes written on Abraham Lincoln. He is by far one of the most written about human beings in human history. And you have found the unicorn. You found new material to bring to light. What inspired you to write this book? What were those new stories you found, some of them, and which maybe was even one of the most surprising?
Well, I'll tell you, what brought me to write the book is not quite as noble, but I'll tell you, and then I'll get to some of the good documents that I found. I was involved in helping the nation to celebrate the 350th anniversary of Jewish life in this country, and I had just become the director of the American Jewish Archives, and I was motivated to do this because my predecessor, the distinguished scholar, historian Jacob Rader Marcus, was very involved in the celebration of the tercentenary 50 years earlier. So I was just following in his footsteps, hoping in a small way to live up to what he would have wanted me to do. And after that experience, frankly, I had an opportunity to meet many wonderful people here at the National Archives. I met people at the Library of Congress. I enjoyed the experience, and I was involved in a commission related to this experience. And someone on the commission said, "Are you going to be on the Lincoln Commission?" And I said, "I don't know a thing about it." So they said, "Well, you should be on it, Zola. It'll be very interesting. And there's a whole story about Lincoln and the Jews." Right. And I said, "Well, how do you get involved in it?" And he said to me, "Well, just write to your governor and have your governor appoint you to the Academic Advisory Commission from Ohio."
Simple as that.
I happened to know the governor at the time, so I asked if I could be appointed, and lo and behold, there I was. And at the very first meeting of this Academic Advisory Council, suddenly I found myself in a room with people like Doris Kearns Goodwin and many of the scholars who were writing books on Lincoln at the time, and people were introducing themselves one to the other, and finally it comes to me, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to say? Because I don't know a thing really about Lincoln, and I had not planned to write anything at all. I mean, I did come from Illinois, but I didn't think that was going to impress them. So I just mustered every bit of courage I could, and I said, "My name is Gary Zola. I direct the American Jewish Archives." I told them what it was, and I said, "I plan to do everything I can to teach the American Jewish community about the story of Abraham Lincoln and the Jews," which was all sincere and true. But in the teaching, Erin, of doing it, once I got involved and I had to prepare, that's when I discovered there was a whole story that I wasn't aware of, even though I did know a little bit about Lincoln and the Jews, some of the more famous episodes. And I wanted to retell that story and capture it. I realized it had been 60 years since anybody really had written seriously on Lincoln and the Jews. So let me tell you, if I can,
I'd love to.
one or two of the famous documents. So you already heard, I think it was Jim that you brought, maybe Laura talked about this fellow. This is Abraham Lincoln's chiropodist, his podiatrist. But don't mock him. This man was not just trimming Lincoln's toenails. He was a remarkable human being, came here from England, and probably was able to meet Lincoln because he was a very capable podiatrist, and he was able to give some of the high military echelon some comfort in their feet. And they kept recommending him higher and higher. In fact, take a look here. He finally gets to treat Lincoln's feet, and there you have a real document from the Chappelle Foundation, a collection where you see Dr. Zachary has operated on my feet with great success and can considerable addition to my comfort. By the way, the important thing is the date on that. You know, that's September 22nd, and I make mention of that in the book. You know, that's the date that the Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary emancipation, was issued. So you wonder, you know, what was Lincoln's day like? You know, I mean, he was amazing. You know, but nevertheless, now to go on, I think Laura did mention this, and that is that Zachary was really a person of some caliber, and there are many documents which will demonstrate and prove, I've reproduced many of them in the book, that Lincoln took him seriously. He was a thoughtful person, and he had ideas, and Lincoln and Seward and Stanton all had regard for this man. He was not a buffoon.
Right.
He was ambitious, and he could be a little bit of a sycophant, but he was an intelligent man. And as some know, throughout the course of the war, there was an ongoing discussion of whether or not we should try to negotiate a peace with the South and bring the bloodshed to an end, or whether there should be unconditional victory. And as some people who study Lincoln know, this is something that seemed to, he dabbled with this, and every time the opportunity came to negotiate, he would eventually back away from it. But apparently, I can't tell the whole story because we'll get to only a small area if I get too involved in every story. But Zachary actually arranges for a meeting with the brains of the South, Judah P. Benjamin. And although we have always known that there was a desire for these two people to meet, there was never any concrete evidence, any documentary evidence that the two had actually met and discussed the peace plan.
Right.
And you're looking at, right now, an image from the Library of Congress. This is the actual document which David McKenzie, I don't know, is David in the room? If he's not, Laura introduced him to me, and I tried to offer suggestions. And of course, the secret is the letter is where it was buried someplace where it shouldn't have been. And probably because I was a bad researcher, I sent him to the wrong area and ends up finding this letter. But as you can see, I'll just blow up this one area. I can't read it from where it's sitting now, but I can tell you essentially what it says. In the context of the letter, he basically says, if you can read it, he says, I shall go to Washington, and I shall meet with Lincoln, and he says, and I shall tell Lincoln that there will be no petition for peace by the South. And then he goes on to say, I'm going to try to talk sense into Lincoln on your behalf and tell him to negotiate peace. And he says, at the last little area that I've blown up, he says, I cannot explain. He says, I don't know what brought us together ultimately, what it was, but maybe it'll be for something good. Anyway, it's all reproduced in the book. It's really a remarkable document. So there are two examples of wonderful documents that I found. And by the way, I want to give credit to the Southern Illinois University Press for publishing the book the way it appears. If people enjoy it, then it's their credit, not mine. Because when I submitted the manuscript originally, Erin, I submitted it as a narrative history with just some documents in the back and an appendix, which was standard. And they said to me, we will consider publishing your work. There's a lot of new material, but we want to recommend that you do it in a different way. Every chapter, write about a 10 to 15 page narrative followed by documents that are illuminated, meaning by that I mean that head notes. And to tell you the truth, that was a lot more work than I had anticipated. I thought I was done. And now I had to go back and really reorganize it. And I probably, to tell you the truth, probably wouldn't have done it had I known how much work it was ultimately going to be, but I, in my mind, thought, okay, well, this isn't going to be so hard. I'll just separate what I was doing, and I'll bring the documents to the back of the chapters, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it took a lot longer, but if you like it, then it is to their credit, because it was their idea to say, make it very broad in its usage, make it so that people who just want to read the narrative can read the first 15 pages of every chapter. They don't have to worry about the documents, but people, students, others who want to really see these interesting documents that you've uncovered, go ahead and put those at the back of each chapter and illuminate them, meaning put head notes on them. So that's how it happened.
It's so much more satisfying than footnotes, because you actually can dive into those primary source documents, and it makes it really enjoyable on a whole new level. So I'm glad they talked you into doing it that way. Well, you gave a couple examples of Lincoln's interactions with Jewish Americans. And Abraham Lincoln was the first president to regularly interact with Jews prior to arriving at the White House. The influx of immigrants creates, there was a major shift in immigration demographics that helped make that possible, isn't that right?
That's right.
So what made these immigrants more likely to be involved in politics? Because that also impacted Lincoln's role in politics, did it not?
Right. It has been generally agreed by scholars that Abraham Lincoln probably, when he was getting ready to run for Senate, or he wanted to be chosen to be senator and by the legislature, and ultimately when he ran for president, probably knew more Jews than all of his 15 predecessors put together. But as my teacher and colleague, Professor Jonathan Sarna, says, when he was a boy, probably the only Jews he knew were those in the Bible. And so the question is, what happened between those 50 years? And in Dr. Sarna's book, I'm stealing a page just to show you what a generous scholar I am, as I'm promoting his book too. There's a whole page in which you have a description of all the different Jews that Lincoln knew, including those who were distant connections and those who were really in an inner circle. And the answer to your question, Erin, has to do with immigration. Right. You're looking at the good old Midwest, what was called in those days the Northwest Territory, or in the early part of the 19th century. And this was a period that, if you stop and think about it, when Lincoln was born in 1809, there were no major urban areas in any of this part of the world. Think about Cincinnati, think about St. Louis, think about Chicago. These places were either non-existent or barely existed. By, of course, mid-century, Cincinnati, Ohio, as an example, becomes the 5th largest urban area in the United States of America. So this is a part of the nation which explodes. And what scholars, not myself, but others have shown is that huge numbers of immigrants came, many from Central Europe, from German extraction, or what would be the German states, and Austria and the Alsace region. And these immigrants who came and settled here, at some point 70–80% of all those who were moving between the 1840s and the 1860s were from abroad. In that crowd were German Jews. And many of the Germans, or those, to be correct, those who came from what would become Germany, what ultimately would become Germany, the German states, both non-Jews and Jews together, many of them who came here had been very involved in the liberal revolutions in Europe, and had been disappointed by the reactionary responses and the failures of these revolutions. So when they come over here, they're already primed, many of them, for these new and liberal ideas of the North. That isn't to say, we have to remember that some of those same people went down into the South. And some of those people settled down there, and some of those people became slaveholders. But be that as it may, that's true. Many of these people who settled in this part of the country become very active in politics, very active in community affairs, be very concerned about the welfare of society and abolition, even though they may not have been formally abolitionists, but the disdain for slavery was important to them. And the last thing I'll say, and then we can go on, is that no American politician who, in that part of the world, who hoped to have broad communal support, national support,
Right.
not little regional support, would be able to do so by offending these foreigners, because there was no one else who would vote for you. I mean,
Right.
this was a huge part of the population. So Lincoln, among others, he wasn't the only one, but Lincoln probably was very much shaped, there's no doubt about it, by the fact that he was used to hearing people who didn't speak English perfectly. He was used to hearing people who had, seeing people who had different customs. And I believe it's logical that he would become accustomed to that, and he would adjust to that kind of a reality. And that played a role in his spirit, the kind of man he was, among many
Right.
other things that shaped him.
Well, and he also, I mean, we know that he bought a German language newspaper.
That's right.
So we know that he was trying to speak directly to them in their language in a way, and had a very different response to the immigrants than those in the Know Nothing Party. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Well, as you know, he one of his, I'll show you a slide of his buddy Abraham Jonas, but there's an exchange in the book that I reproduce where Jonas tells him in the 1840s, I believe, maybe the early 1850s, that he's been accused, somebody accused him of being a member of the Know Nothing Party, you know, that is anti-foreign, you know, initiative. And Lincoln is appalled by this, and there's a back and forth with them. So yes, I think that I don't want to make Lincoln sound in this instance utilitarian
Right.
uniquely, meaning that the only reason he took these positions was because he had presidential ambitions
Right,
or something.
he was
I
seeking
think
votes.
that was the kind of human being he was, but I'm trying to say that I like to think that as a young man, as you grow up and you're used to, I'll give you other examples of this in a minute,
Right.
but you know, as you're used to seeing people who don't speak, who, like you do, who are not accustomed to the way things are done in that part of the country, who are obviously different, they have different background, different cultural norms. This, I think, will incline some people to being more open, as of being others who want to close
Right.
down.
Well, let's talk about the Jonas family, because they, in many ways, illustrate what was happening to many American families during the Civil War, because they were a divided family once the Civil War came, weren't they?
That's
Can you tell
right.
us about
Yes,
that?
that's right. Well,
and that unique relationship that Abraham Lincoln had with Abraham Jonas.
yes, well, Lincoln, as you'll see here, you know, when Lincoln lived in Springfield, it's just coincidental that as he's arrived at quite a distinguished point in his career, this is the very point when Jews begin to move into Springfield, and they'll become business people in the city of in the community of Springfield, and Lincoln becomes friends with many of them, and we know this from the documents. Here is a man who was one of the founders of the Hebrew congregation in Springfield, which took shape in the early 1850s, a man by the name of Julius Hammerslau, and Hammerslau becomes a haberdasher, and there's definite evidence that some of Lincoln's suits were bought from Mr. Hammerslau, but Hammerslau was also a friend of the family. He escorts Mary Todd's family to the inauguration in 1860. You know, Lincoln also met a lot of people while he was traveling around on the 8th Circuit, you know, and one of the stores he would visit was the store that belonged to a man named Henry Rice. So apparently President Lincoln liked Henry Rice at least enough to endorse General McClellan's wish that Rice be appointed a sutler. For those of you who don't know what a sutler is, that's an important position. That's a patronage position. That gives a person opportunity to provide the military with goods and services. And if you have those sutler buttons or coins that enable you to do that, that's sort of like in a or something, you know. In other words, you have a special in to selling to quite a large captive audience. And here I took this picture myself. This is This is the grave. I was so happy to meet him, even though he was very quiet, Mr. Salzenstein, because I had read all about him. And then I went to Springfield to speak, and I was able to actually visit his grave, Louis Salzenstein, because there's a lot of material on Louis Salzenstein. Louis Salzenstein had a shop in a place called Athens, Illinois. Now, from those of you who are from the East Coast, I would like to educate you. I don't want you to make fools of yourself by mispronouncing the word A-T-H-E-N-S as Athens. Because then everybody in Illinois will laugh at you, because everybody knows that it's Athens, Illinois. And that's about, by car today, 25 minutes from Springfield. So he's buried in Springfield, but he had a store. And here's a picture of the store that he had. He bought the famous post office building called the Rogers Building, which was in Athens. And Lincoln had been there many times. And if you go on the internet, I think you'll still be able to see, if you look up Athens, Salzenstein, whose, by the way, his nickname was Old Salty, and the Rogers Building, you'll see that apparently there's still a little area in that building, which is a historic building, dedicated to Lincoln's memory, because Lincoln apparently liked Salzenstein so much that whenever he came through Athens, he would sleep in the front of Salzenstein or Old Salty's store. So I like to say, you know, if you want to see where Washington or Jefferson or Franklin slept, you have to go to the East Coast. You want to go and see where Abraham Lincoln slept, you have to go to Athens, Illinois. Now I'll talk to you about the Jonas brothers. Oh my goodness, these are not the real Jonas brothers. Here are the Jonas brothers. These are the real Jonas brothers. You're looking at Joseph Jonas and Abraham Jonas. Now, Joseph Jonas, he is a very famous and important person in Cincinnati, Ohio, because Joseph Jonas is known to be, he argued that he was the first Jew in Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, we know today from documentary evidence he wasn't the first Jew in Ohio. However, Joseph Jonas lived to be very old, and he wrote his memoirs. So all of us who are involved in the preservation of documents, this is an important lesson, because if you preserve your own record and you outlive everyone else, it entitles you perhaps to say whatever you'd like. You can shape history how you think it should be said. He brought his brother Abraham Jonas over here. They came from Plymouth, England. That was probably a stopping point, so they knew English, and there they learned how to be watchmakers. And Abraham Jonas and Joseph Jonas married. I'm talking now to those of you who are erudite in American Jewish history. These two boys married the daughters of Gershon Mendes-Satius, who was the rabbi of Shereth Israel, the historic congregation in New York. And then these two girls came to Cincinnati, and I don't want anybody to generalize about this, what I'm about to tell you, because it's very unkind, but they all died in Cincinnati, so don't generalize now. But they died very young, and Joseph and Abraham both remarried, but Abraham was unhappy, evidently, in Cincinnati, and he left his brother. He went first to Kentucky, then he went to a city in Illinois called Quincy. Mm-hmm. And in Quincy, he ran into a young man who had also just become a lawyer, and that young man was another Abraham, and this is probably how Lincoln looked when he met Abraham Jonas back in that day. These two men become very good friends, and I think the story you're leading up to, Erin, is that Abraham Jonas, who had about 5 or 6 children, some of them did fight for the South, and some of them did fight for the North, or supporters of the North. And one of his sons was in jail, had been captured, and just to show you the kind of loyalty that Lincoln had to his friend, who I have pretty much a whole chapter on this, but it's impossible to do this briefly, but all I can tell you is that Abraham Jonas was not simply a peripheral friend of Lincoln's. These two people, Abraham Lincoln and Abraham, good friends. They were political allies. Mm-hmm. And clearly Jonas played a role in getting his career started. The two of these fellas both leave the Whig Party at the same time. They're involved in starting the Republican Party in the early 1850s. Jonas it clearly played a role in maneuvering the nomination so that Lincoln could be considered.
Yep.
And Abraham Lincoln did not forget his friend. Jonas is dying of cancer in 1864. Lincoln had appointed him Postmaster General of Quincy, which was a patronage position in repayment for the friendship. And when he's dying, his family appeals to Lincoln and asks Lincoln if he will let the son who fought for the Confederacy to go up and, Charles, to go up and visit his father. His son makes it there a day and a half or so right before the father passes away, what Lincoln did. And then, if that wasn't enough, Lincoln appoints the wife, the widow, to take over her husband's position. So this is, of course, you don't need to see this, but this is a letter Lincoln writes to him long before this incident I've described, and I've underlined the line where Lincoln says to him in a letter, "You are one of my most valued friends." And anyone who's studied Abraham Lincoln knows Lincoln weighed his words very carefully. Lincoln was not, you'll pardon the Latin, he was not a schmoozer. And so in that way, and so Lincoln really, I think this was probably, of all his friends, probably his closest friend who was Jewish. I always wanted to know why were the Lincoln-Douglas debates in Quincy. It wasn't until I studied this book, this episode, I realized that it was because really because of Jonas. Jonas lived there, and Jonas brought the debates there, among other places.
Right.
Let's see if I have anything else to tell you about.
We have to.
Oh yes, you'll
you have
all
to talk
like
about-
you'll like this story. So one of the things I try to explain in the book is I try to explain that in addition to everything else, Lincoln had remarkable human qualities. We know that from so many things we read. And obviously, he just had a way of, he knew how to deal with people. And part of that was learning how to deal with people who were not like him.
Right.
So this man, Altshuler, is a Bavarian Jew who comes to the United States and immigrates along with others in the late 1840s and decides he wants to be a photographer. So he settles in Champaign-Urbana, and he hears in 1857 that the famous lawyer, Abraham Lincoln, is coming to town. So when Lincoln shows up, Altshuler has the gumption to walk up to him and say, "Mr. Lincoln, I would like you to come over to my shop so I can take a picture of you." Now, Lincoln didn't know this. He didn't know this man from anything. He didn't know him at all, and I can imagine he spoke with an accent. And listen, if you're all you have when in those days are these few pictures that might appear in a press or someplace, the last thing you would want is someone to take a god-awful picture of you and have that used.
Although
But
Lincoln would have a sense of humor about that.
Apparently, yeah, I think you're right. But he apparently goes over there and he
Right.
brings, he doesn't want to waste his time, so he brings a colleague with him. Thank God he brought a colleague by the name of Cunningham with him, because that Cunningham would later write about the incident. And this picture that I'm showing you now is a recreation of the incident. So what apparently happens is he shows up at the shop and he's wearing his famous white smock coat, Lincoln. And this upsets, Altshuler, who's going to miss his opportunity to have a great picture. So he says, "Would you please go back to the hotel and put your dark frock coat on?" And Lincoln says, "I didn't bring it with me. I don't have it." So he doesn't want to miss that. He says, "Well, would Mr. Lincoln be willing to wear my dark coat?" He says, "Oh, okay." So Lincoln decides he'll put on the coat, but nobody thought in advance that Mr. Altshuler was 5'6" and Lincoln is 6'4". So when Lincoln puts on the coat,
Right.
his
That's a good
sleeves
effect.
look just like this. See, and this apparently, according to Cunningham, Lincoln cannot stop laughing. And he thinks this is so funny, and every time Altshuler would get under the curtain to take a picture, Lincoln would start laughing again. And as you know,
Picture.
you can't take a picture in those days. They braced your head. You had to sit still, which is one of the reasons why people don't smile in these pictures, because the movement of your cheeks could blur the picture. And so Cunningham says that he finally says to Altshuler, tell me a joke. If you make me laugh, it'll get it out of my system. And this goes on for a long time, and he never gives up. Lincoln doesn't walk out. Eventually, they snap this picture. This is the famous Altshuler picture. And there are people who say, if you look at the corner of Lincoln's lips, he looks as though he's pursing his lips as if to try hard not to laugh. Who knows? But this is very famous, also famous because it's without his beard. And the last thing I'll show you very quickly is, I love this particular story. This is Abraham Cohen. Now, Abraham Cohen is a well-known figure in American Jewish history because he wrote a lot of memoirs about his life and was an active leader in the Jewish community. In fact, he was the president of Kehilat Anshe Mariv in Chicago, KAM, the first Hebrew congregation in Chicago. But more important to Abraham Lincoln was when he meets Cohen, Cohen is the sitting city clerk of the city of Chicago. So he's a Democrat. He's not a Republican. So apparently they're introduced, and according to Cohen's daughter, Lincoln manages somehow to sweep Mr. Cohen off his feet. And evidently, according to her, they discuss the Hebrew Bible. And some of you know, Lincoln used to always say that he was not highly educated, and the few things he knew, he only knew limited things, but that which he knew he had read again and again and again. And of course, the Hebrew Bible was one such thing. Apparently, he persuaded this past president of a congregation that he had an appreciation for the Hebrew Bible. And so, according to the daughter, the Democrat becomes a supporter of Abraham Lincoln. And when Lincoln wins the election and is about to head off to Washington, people are sending to Springfield presents for the president, wishing him well. And Mr. Cohen draws on silk this colorized version, what I'm about to show you. It's a flag, and on the bars and stripes, he writes the Hebrew verses from the first chapter of the book of Joshua. Be strong and courageous, be not afraid, be not dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Who knows, maybe this was a wish for Lincoln's welfare or what have you. And I actually found a glass negative in the Spertus Museum in Chicago, which they didn't even know they had. And that's how the colorized flag, that's a glass reproduction. That's all that's left of the flag. The flag, we know, hung in the White House, according to a secretary who wrote a thank you letter, but it's disappeared after Lincoln's death. But to me, it symbolizes, again, how Lincoln had this winning way with about his ability to reach out and to communicate to Jews, that he had an appreciation and openness to them.
Even if they were political adversaries.
Even if they were political adversaries.
So Lincoln certainly understood that they were all individuals. And then we've heard about General Orders Number 11, which treats them as a class.
Yes.
In your book, you offer several explanations for what might have happened, including a theory that involves Grant's own father.
Yes.
Can you please tell us what's behind Grant's order and what the public response was
Well,
and Lincoln's response?
Erin, here is probably the only time you'll ever hear Zola say, I'm not sure that I agree with Dr. Sarna. Because Dr. Sarna, in general, knows a heck of a lot more than Zola about almost everything. But if you haven't read it, you should read Dr. Sarna's wonderful book, which was, I think, featured here in one of these lectures a few years ago. It's called When Grant Expelled the Jews. And let me see if I can move to that document real quick. This is about the chaplaincy. We're going to skip over this because I don't know if we'll get to it. We may have to go back to it. But with Grant, we know that other generals were having these problems with, let's refer to them as profiteers, people who would go into the South, would buy up cotton or other products, then bring them back to the North. They would make profits on those, gouging people in the North, and of course enriching people in the South, or at least putting money into the economy. And there is a great story, there's no doubt it's true, and that is that his father, that is Grant's father, with two Jewish businessmen named the Mack brothers from Cincinnati, go down to Holly Springs, and they talk the father into trying to persuade the general into giving them permission to go and do this. According to Dr. Sarna, I think if I understand what Dr. Sarna has written, is that Grant is so inflamed and angry, he already knows this has been a problem with profiteers, and here are these two Jewish businessmen who've actually enlisted his father's help to try to persuade him. They're so angry he can't take it out on his son, and so instead he takes it out on these Jewish businessmen, and he ejects the Jews. I don't know. Here's what I think. Earlier, this is from the National Archives. I'm grateful to the archives for giving me a facsimile, a scan of this document. It's in part. I pasted it together, and I'm going to show you the key phrases here. As you see in the open lines, it says there, I'll circle it for you. The Jews as a class, and they're having violated all the department orders and so forth and so on, are expelled, and they have 24 hours in which to leave. Now, I think the secret might be, this is my theory, might be in the words, the Jews as a class, because that word, in other words, I wonder how confused the language was with profiteer, peddler, Jew profiteer. If you stop and think about, for example, in the South, how so many people will say things like, I got a good bargain on this, I'm going to Jew you down on it. And of course, for the Jew, this is an appalling term to use that. But I have personally met so many people who had no idea that they're using the word J-E-W. They may think they're using the word C-H-E-W or what have you. They don't understand it. Or, to take another example, that I grew up on, somebody would say when you're a little boy, I've been gypped. And it's only until you're made aware of the fact that you're making a slur or referring to gypsies.
Right.
So my theory is I'm wondering how blurred the identity between Jewish peddlers, Jewish profiteers, the Jews as a class. In other words, he doesn't say the Jews, men, women, and children.
Right.
He doesn't say the Jews, the entire community.
Right.
He says the Jews as a class. And I'm wondering, this is my question, is in his blurred mind at this time, and he later, Grant will say, I regret, if I had thought about this for 1 minute, I wouldn't have written that.
Right.
And if that's true, it seems to me that that's at least as possible as the idea that he was angry at these two Jews for getting his father involved. There's so many stories about how to explain it. It's almost inexplicable, and it's so upsetting because it's the only time in all of American history that Jews were banished from American territory. And if it weren't for Lincoln, who immediately,
right.
I mean, here's the rest of the story, this man is the great hero of this story. This is Caesar J. Caskell. And he's from Paducah. Again, a German immigrant who comes to this country, and he settles in Paducah, Kentucky. So I like to tell people where all the mighty Jewish communities are now situated. If it weren't for the Jews of Paducah, Kentucky, God knows where we would be. Caskell is a businessman. He isn't a profiteer at all, but it just so happens that the provost marshal who gets this particular issue, the order, decides he's going to act on it, and he throws all the Jews of Paducah out. Men, women, and children, in 24 hours, they're put on a boat, sent up to Cincinnati, Ohio. He gets off the boat. He goes right away to see, he says, I went to see the famous Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise. Wise says to him, don't you worry, my boy, I'm going to take this up with B'nai B'rith. We're going to have a national protest. But Caskell is not satisfied with that, and he gets on trains and he gets on carriages, and within 2 weeks he's in Washington, D.C. on January the 3rd, 1863, 2 days after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. With help, he gets in at 8 o'clock at night to see Abraham Lincoln, and he shows Lincoln his expulsion orders, which he's carried all this way and which he's shown to newspaper reporters all along the way, which is how we have been able to recreate much of this.
Well, and that's an important thing, right? Because people doubted that it was true.
That's right. Even Lincoln looks at it, and when he tells him, Lincoln says, I don't believe that.
Right.
And then he shows him that, and then, of course, this famous exchange, which is the one thing in the book I tried hard to document, and I can't find the source. If anybody can help me, I'd be very grateful to you, but it's such a good story. As Dr. Marcus used to say, sometimes you have to tell the story even if you can't document it. And the story goes that Caskell says to Lincoln, here's my expulsion orders. And Lincoln, when he sees it in black and white, he looks at Caskell and he says, so I'm given to understand that the children of Israel have been expelled from the happy land of Canaan. And Caskell says, I rejoined by saying, that is correct, Mr. President, which is why we have come unto Father Abraham's bosom for protection. And Lincoln says that protection you will have. So he issues an he revokes the order. And I'm showing you now a document featuring an important Washington, D.C. Jew. This is Adolphus Solomons. I think Laura was mentioning this.
Right.
I'll blow up the document. Solomon sends a telegram to the head of the B'nai B'rith in St. Louis. And he says the following, this is the most important part of it. He says, I have just seen General Halleck. That's because Lincoln turns to the congressman and to Caskell and says, take this to General Halleck tomorrow. And I have revoked the order. And I'm ordering him to revoke the order because he was Grant's boss. So here the document says, just seen General Halleck, who revoked General Grant's vile order on the 4th. That would be the day after the 3rd, unless I'm mistaken. The day it was received here. So it was received at night, and the next day it was revoked immediately. And it took a while before. But the point is, heroism is, of course, that he immediately sees the injustice of this and he revokes the order. He becomes very famous for doing that.
Let's go back to the chaplain controversy,
All right.
if we can.
Okay.
Because this is one of a few instances in which the specificity of it being Christian causes the problem. So Lincoln asks Congress for a bill to raise a volunteer army for each state. The proposed bill includes a provision for regimental commanders to appoint military chaplains of, quote, some Christian denomination.
That's correct. And of course, Jews had already begun enlisting, and so this becomes a major to-do. The Jewish newspapers take it up. Jews are indignant, and it becomes a huge to-do. And so in New York, there is an organization which had just recently come into existence called the Board of Delegates of American Israelites. And this board decides it will take up the mission and try to persuade. They want Lincoln to change the order, I think by executive fiat. And so they send this man, Rabbi Arnold Fischel, to Washington, D.C. This is in 1861, in the first year of his presidency. This is in December. And Fischel says he goes down to Washington. They put him up in a hotel. And on days when Lincoln was seeing patronage citizens who would come in on whatever days of the week that was, he was doing that excessively. Fischel shows up a December day, and he decides he's going to wait in line. He says to the man in front of him, he says, how long have you been here? And the man retorts, he says, this is my 3rd day waiting to see the president. So Fischel doesn't know what's going to be, but suddenly, he says, somebody came and said, where's the rabbi? And they bring him all the way into the office, and he said he was unprepared, and suddenly he finds himself sitting in front of Lincoln. So he pulls himself together. He goes through all the documents. He makes his case. He says he writes to his bosses who sent him there, who paid for him to go, and he says he asked Lincoln to change the order. Lincoln says, I want to think about it. Give me an opportunity. Come back tomorrow, and I'll see you tomorrow, and I'll give you my answer. When he comes back the next day, Lincoln is not there. He's not available, and Feschel is worried he's gotten the bum's rush. He goes back to his hotel room. Several days pass, 2, 3, 4 days pass, and he doesn't know what to do. Should he go to New York? Should he return home? They're paying for his hotel room. And then he receives a telegram, he says, which elates him. And fortunately, he was so happy to receive this telegram that he wrote the actual wording of the telegram into the letter, the telegram that he sends to New York to the people who paid his way. And if he hadn't done that, we might not have known what was in the telegram, because the telegram itself apparently is lost. And just a little section of it, as you can see, I underline the most important part. He says, Lincoln says, I'm not going to do this single-handedly. I want to work to get Congress to revamp the law entirely. I want to change the law in Congress and overturn the law that was in place. This he does succeed in doing in 5 months. And Lincoln works. I provide the document. Lincoln works behind the scenes to make sure that this happens. It's not passive. He's very active in seeing to it that that takes place. So yes, this Lincoln again sees the injustice of a military chaplaincy that only Christians are able to serve their people, and it's under Lincoln that the first Jewish chaplain in the history of the United States is appointed. And these items that we're talking about, Lincoln's presidential accomplishments with the Jews, meaning the revocation of the order, the chaplaincy law, and one other item that I talk about in the book, which is having to do with trying to Christianize America.
Right.
These are achievements, actions that Lincoln will take that endear him to the Jew and make him a larger-than-life figure to his contemporaries.
Right. And that continues on and builds in his legacy.
Right.
On your dedication page, you have one of my favorite Lincoln quotes. The struggle of today is not altogether for today. It is for a vast future also. And it was Rabbi Isaac Wise, I believe, who reminded his own readers that the way America treated its Jews would be a barometer of liberty for the nation's future. Can you please speak to Lincoln's legacy and how it has grown over time?
Well, Lincoln's legacy, let me skip ahead to, Lincoln's legacy begins with the Jews when he's assassinated, meaning his memorial, how he's memorialized. And this was, to me, overwhelming when I began to read both in the German and the English sermons or eulogies on Lincoln. What was so astonishing, everyone knows that he was eulogized all over the country, but I couldn't help but see again and again how constantly being Judaized.
Yeah.
In other words, they were transforming him into a Jew. And I'll just bring you a few examples of this. Benjamin Zola, some of you in the audience may know that name because his daughter Henrietta Zola was the founder of Hadassah, the women's organization. And he, in his German eulogy, he says, even while that's they hand him died when it comes to Blarney. And that is Isaac Mayer Wise, who will forever change history when he gets up and offers this. This is the same man who, you know, Erin, in my book I point out, didn't like Lincoln.
Nope.
And
Not one bit.
actually, literally 5 months before this eulogy, he literally in print refers to Lincoln as an idiot.
Yep.
But when he's eulogizing him, look what he says. He says, brethren, the lamented Abraham Lincoln believed himself to be bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh. He supposed himself to be a descendant of Hebrew parentage. He said so in my presence. And indeed, he preserved numerous features of the Hebrew race, both in countenance and character. which is, of course, ridiculous because everyone knows Lincoln did not have red hair. But,
I love it.
Erin is the mother of a redhead, so she can appreciate that. And by the way, this was not the only, because some people said, well, Zola, you're only quoting Reform rabbis, because the true Orthodox rabbis, the pietists wouldn't have said this. And that's just not true. They didn't read my whole book. In Solomon Schechter, a great president of the Jewish Theological Seminary, was in love with Abraham Lincoln, referred to him as the greatest man of all time in his presidential address when he accepts the presidency of the JTS. And then later he writes a whole article comparing Abraham Lincoln to Rabbi Hillel of the Talmud. Mm-hmm. That's Schechter about which I'm speaking. And on Lincoln's 100th birthday, no less than Bernard Revel, who was the founding president and great leader of Yeshiva University, the Orthodox institution in New York, he gave a whole address honoring Lincoln on his birthday. And look at what, I'm quoting that address. He says, "If Lincoln can justly be called the first typical American, he can more justly be said to represent the summation of all the noblest qualities in Judaism." Mm-hmm. This, to me, goes on and on. It continues on to the present day. It is, to me, unbelievable. Everybody embraces and wants to find a piece of Lincoln. Mm-hmm. But I think that what's really remarkable is that there's this tendency among Jews to want Lincoln to actually be, it's almost as if to say he has to have descent, his name, his everything about him, his beard, he has to be one of us. And that's what some of the people have said. And this goes on. If you don't believe me, just go home, and there's good reason not to believe me, but go home and look on the internet and just type in Lincoln and Jew, and you will come across 2 or 3 different sites which are trying to prove to you that Lincoln literally could very well have been. And as a lesson. I see that as a demonstration of what I try to argue in this book, which is simply
questions and answers. There are microphones. We will start on, looks like you're ready right here. We'll start with you.
Dr. Zola, I'm a college student here in the Washington, D.C. area, and your book is one of the most interesting books on this topic that I've read, and for me one of the most meaningful aspects of your book was the story about Lincoln pardoning the young Jewish soldier who went absent without leave to visit his mother, who was on her deathbed. And one thing I'm wondering, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about this. I'm wondering whether part of what motivated President Lincoln to pardon this young Jewish soldier was Lincoln's memories of his own mother passing away when Lincoln moved during. I'm wondering, soldier.
Well, thank you for your kind words very much about my book, and thank you for a good question like that. I'll begin by saying what I'm about to say is really just an opinion, and it's not necessarily anchored in great scholarship, but I think it's common sense that most of us, all human beings, are shaped by all these experiences that we have in youth and in childhood. There have been many scholars who've written books on Lincoln's disposition, on the loss not only of his mother, but of a beloved a woman he wanted to marry originally, Anne Rutland, and not a very supportive human being. And I think that can be very illuminating. It's just I'm not an expert in that in any way, except to say that I do think it makes good sense. And one sees in so much of Lincoln's documented story, not make-believe, but documented, this deeply compassionate heart. I mean, even when it's not dealing with Jewish deserters in general, I mean, it's been pointed out that Lincoln's generals and others are constantly on him to be stricter in terms of exacting discipline for people who run away and so forth. And Lincoln is hesitant to do that. Lincoln is so punctilious about examining this story, about the Native American Indians. I'm not an expert in this whole area, but that, which Lincoln is often criticized for, but apparently I'm told he goes through all the records one by one. He seems to have a very caring heart. And I personally believe the answer to your question, without having studied this in a primary fashion, is that it makes common sense that your thoughts are correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir.
Zola, I have two questions. One is a trivial question, which you probably say no. I was sitting here thinking, were you related to Emile Zola and the Dreyfus situation and, the Jacques Hughes? I keep saying maybe you have someone in your family.
Well, that would be an honor. Of course, the best I can offer you is this, that my name was changed from a Russian name right around the time of the clemency for Dreyfus.
Okay.
And since Zlotowitz, which is one form of my name, or Zlotkov, which is another form that both appear in documents, neither which are naturally inclined towards Z-O-L-A, I theorize that possibly this was the very Jewish tradition of honoring someone non-Jewish who was heroic to the Jews, just like Alexander or Cyrus and many other Jews were given the name Zola during this period, sometimes as a middle name or a first name. So I can't prove it, but it makes a nice wishful thinking. So.
Okay. Now let me ask my deeply serious
please.
question. In the 1850s, a lot of the Jews, the German Jews, came from Europe, as you mentioned, and they invested a lot of their lives in things in the South.
Yeah.
Cotton industry, shipping. And so maybe the future Republicans, the abolitionists, felt that this was a group that's not located in the North, that's not going to allow the country to eliminate slavery and will be bad. And maybe that was in the back of Grant's father's head or whatever, or maybe Lincoln understood this, that he had enemies because of economic reasons. So in studying this, how would the Jews in New York or in Boston or in the East who were against abolition feeling about it? Because there was a very controversial time in the early 1860s. Who would go to war and who not? And if your whole career is based on investments in the South, which a lot of Jews were. So it's an economic question.
Well, yeah, I'll say this. There were examples of, let's take your readers, they were in the Midwest and in the South. So I think many researchers believe that one of the reasons that Lincoln was that Wise was at the very least disinterested in war breaking out, and certainly was not going to write or get himself involved in the topic of slavery, was because so many of his readers were there. So there's an example of something like that. And there, I'm sure, were businessmen, many who fell into that category. There were also people in the North, as you know, who would like to have seen the war brought to an end and settled.
Yes.
And there were Jews in that group, too, who felt that enough death had taken place. So, yes, it's a complicated story. basically, I don't know if this is the question you're asking, but basically, we often would like to think, I think Jews would like to think that in the matter of slavery, in light of our Jewish history, the broader context, that we behaved in a more noble and self-conscious way in opposition to slavery. But the facts really don't bear that out. There were Jews who fought slavery. There were Jews who had slaves, and it more or less breaks down in accordance with the general population, more or less. Mm-hmm. In this way, it's in contradistinction to the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s. Mm-hmm. In those days, the eagerness to belong, the opportunities that they found wherever they came in this country, whether it's the South or the North, overruled almost everything, and they wanted to be a part of the community in which they found themselves and which accepted them so readily. That's I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Well, and actually one of your primary source documents that I found most startling was the diary entry from Eleanor Cohen.
Oh, yes.
Can you tell everyone about that just briefly?
Yeah.
Because the language is kind of shocking, especially since it's in the wake of Lincoln's assassination.
Yeah, I tried to bring a few of those. One of the, again, the press deserves credit for this. And for those of you who write books, if there are people in the room who are doing research, and I'll just say that, it's always very difficult to receive criticism from your peers and have them come back after you worked hard on something and say, why don't you do this and why don't you do that? And, you want to tell them, why don't you do something, right? But here's a case where I thought they maybe were being a little hard on me, and they wanted me to work harder in an area, and I went back, and I think it was helpful. And that was, they wanted me to show more about Jews who didn't like Lincoln during his period. And I've brought a number of documents, mm-hmm. but one of the most startling is of a young woman whose diary has survived. Her name was Eleanor Cohen, mm-hmm. and she's from the South, I believe from Charleston, and maybe Columbia. But she's from the South, deep South, and her diary is largely filled with romance, mm-hmm. Stories about her boyfriend and her fiancé and so forth. She's a young girl, but she writes on April 30th, her entry is that she's heard that Lincoln and Johnson and Seward have all been assassinated, and of course that was part of what what was intended. And then she writes something. I'm going to just paraphrase, but she says, "Good. I hope they all rot in hell," or something like that. She expresses real disdain for Lincoln and that he deserved what he got, and he's ruined our country land. And then she goes on blithely to speak about her boyfriend again and so forth. But it does show you that there were surely Jews, and I point out there were Jews on the West Coast in California who have been documented for cheering when they hear that Lincoln was assassinated. So there were these examples, mm-hmm. but largely Lincoln quickly becomes a hero. Even in the South, it doesn't take all that long before it becomes...
All right, we have time for one more question.
Hi. I would like to point out that not only was President Lincoln assassinated on Good Friday, he was assassinated on Passover. And in the Peterson house, there were 16 doctors in attendance, one of whom was Charles Lieberman, who cut off a lock of his hair and presented it through the Surgeon General to Mary Lincoln. So there's a Jewish connection there in the Peterson house.
I make note of that. I do in the book. I mention Dr. Lieberman. Absolutely.
And a funny story is that, I don't know if you know Robert Rosen, who wrote this book.
Yes, I just saw Robert Rosen this past week.
Jewish Confederates. Years ago, he was giving a speech about his book at the Plum Street Temple in Cincinnati, and he's excoriating the Mack brothers. and a person gets up from the audience and says, well, I'm a descendant from the Mack brothers.
Yeah,
And he said,
yeah. Well, that's true. That's how Jonathan Sarna begins his book, with that funny story about that very incident. Yes, no, and the Macks are still in Cincinnati. There's no doubt about it.
Great.
But
Do you have one more story
yes,
that you want
yes.
to share with us?
I
and
was
then
gonna.
we wanna give
I
everyone-
thought I'd share. Let me go through this last. You'll forgive me on all my.
We got a lot.
There's two quotes that I wanted to end with. One I loved. This is from Portnoy's Complaint, and in there the lead character, the protagonist, is musing about two statues that he sees, one of Washington and one of Lincoln, and he describes them both, and he says, Washington, I must confess, leaves me cold. Maybe it's the horse that he's leaning on. At any rate, he is so obviously a goy. But Lincoln, I could cry. Look at him sitting there, so ausgemischt. How he labored for the downtrodden, as will I. You know, but the most touching story that I've come across in a contemporary sense, and I'll end with this. I wish I could tell you that I dug this up myself, but it's a story that was retold in a book I showed the cover by Andrew Ferguson, the author. He contributes to Saturday Review, editor, I believe. And he wrote a book in 2006 called Land of Lincoln. And it's not a history of Lincoln. What he does is he goes around America and he visits sites related to Lincoln. He meets interesting people who have interesting Lincoln memorabilia. It's all about the cultural impact of Lincoln. And he tells a story that he went to see the museum, the new museum in Springfield. And there in Springfield, he's staying at the Hilton Hotel. And he says that while he's in the lobby, he's discussing with the general manager why he's there. And the general manager says, I have to tell you this story. It just happened a few weeks ago. And he says that a man came to stay at the Hilton, and this man was very elderly, and the man clearly had Parkinson's disease, and he was walking with a walker, and the general manager and others in the hotel noticed that he was unstable on his feet, and they were concerned, and he seemed to be by himself. And so they tell the general manager that this man is asking about how to take a cab from the hotel to the Lincoln Memorial, to Lincoln's tomb. He wants to go to Lincoln's tomb. So the general manager decides, I'm going to take you. So he puts him in his car, he takes him to the tomb. He says he goes into the tomb, and there by Lincoln's grave, he cries. And he comes out of the tomb. The manager has, emotional you were, I heard you crying. Could you explain, would you tell me what that was about? And the man proceeds to tell him that when he was a little boy, he was in the concentration camps, and that he was frightened for his life, and that he tells the manager that he had a dream. He'd learned about Lincoln in school in Europe, and he had a dream, and in this dream, Lincoln came to him. And this is what he says. He was in the concentration camp, and he was all alone in his cell. It was the worst time of his life, and he didn't think he could go on anymore. And he said, Mr. Lincoln came to him. Mr. Lincoln stood right in front of him, just like I'm standing in front of you. And Mr. Lincoln said to him, you never forget, all men are created equal. This is true for all men, for all times. And these men who would do this thing to you, who put you here, they are no better than you. You are their equal, because all men are created equal. You keep remembering this, and you persevere, you'll be all right. And he goes on to tell the general manager that his whole life he had made up his mind he was going to go and pay homage to the president, and now at this particular time in his life, he had made up his mind he was going to do it. And I always feel that of all the examples that one could give of how Lincoln's memory, that's what partially my book is about, not just about Lincoln back then, but how in every decade Jews Judaize Lincoln and make him a useful support for the American experience or for their own experience. I don't see that could be much more of a touching story than this one, and a good one, I think, on which to end. And I want to thank all of you for coming.
We called him Rabbi Abraham. The book is for sale right outside. I hope you buy it and join us for the book signing. Thank you so much, Gary. This was wonderful.
Thank you,
It was
Erin.
a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't talk over.
No.
I have a
I'm here
loquacious
just to help.
side. Well, you did a great job.
Makes my job easier, right?
Yeah.
This was wonderful. It was really a pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you very much. I hope you'll tell Archivist Ferriot, who I've had a chance to meet 2 or 3 times, I send my very best.